My name is Calvin Hart, and I'm a man in my late 50s telling my own story the way it unfolded in slow, painful waves that still echo inside me today. And as I speak these words, I can feel that same heavy weight pressing on my chest, because everything that happened in my family felt like a tiny spark that grew into a raging fire right under my nose, while I kept believing that loyalty and love would protect us. But life has a way of proving us wrong, and when I look back now, I still ask myself, over and over again, how did I not see it coming? And how did I not notice the quiet shifts, the uneasy glances, the strange silences that slowly shaped into a plan designed to shake the ground beneath my feet? I used to believe that betrayal always comes from faraway places, from strangers or enemies or people you barely know, but maybe my story will make you see things differently. Because sometimes treachery does not kick the front door open, it walks and gently sits at your dining table and smiles at you like nothing is wrong. And that is exactly what happened to me, because what started all this was nothing more than one missing signature, one tiny piece of paper that seemed harmless and forgettable. But that single blank line was meant to protect my future. And instead it nearly destroyed everything I built with my bare hands, everything I poured my life into from sunup to sundown for more than 30 years. And as I take you through this story, I want you to understand that this is not just about a business, or money, or documents, or legal talk. This is about trust and love, and the type of family loyalty that should have been unbreakable but cracked apart the moment greed walked into the room wearing a friendly face. Because when greed arrives, it does not knock, does not warn, it simply begins eating away at the foundation of everything you believed was safe. And while I did not know it at the time, my life was already shifting in a direction that would test every ounce of strength I had left inside me, and would force me to question the people I grew up with, the people I shared memories with, the people I once defended with all my heart. And even though I stand strong today telling this story with clarity, it was not always like that, because back then I was blind to the truth, and blind to the idea that someone I loved deeply could hold a secret sharp enough to cut me to the core. And the worst part is that the story did not start with conflict or fights or shouting. It started quietly, with warmth and routine, with mornings in the hardware store, with the smell of fresh lumber, and the sound of turning keys, and the gentle knowledge that I was carrying on the legacy my father built long before my hands were strong enough to lift a toolbox. Because that place was more than a business, it was our family heart and soul. And if you think a legacy like that is protected by blood alone, let me tell you that blood means nothing when ambition clouds the spirit and blinds the heart, which is why the moment that single missing signature came into play, my entire world began to tilt and shift and stretch in ways I never imagined, as if life itself was preparing me for a storm I did not even know was forming. And today, as I share this, I want you to walk with me through every twist, because this story will show you just how fragile trust can be, and how quickly everything can fall apart when even one person decides that loyalty is optional and respect is negotiable. And that is why this first moment, this first realization that something was wrong, became the hook that pulled me into the deepest betrayal of my life. A betrayal I never expected from someone who shared my childhood, my memories, my hopes, and my future dreams. And yet it happened right in front of me, disguised as normal life, disguised as family love, disguised as something harmless, all because of one missing signature that should have been simple, but turned into the spark that lit the fire that changed everything forever. I grew up in a small town where folks valued honest work, early mornings, and straight talk, and where a man's word meant something solid and dependable. And every small act carried weight, because everybody knew everybody, and memories lasted longer than seasons. And in that place, my dad stood like a tall oak right in the center of our town, always steady, always reliable, and always ready to help anyone who needed a tool, a spare part, a bit of advice, or even just a moment of friendly talk. And that was the spirit of our family business, a hardware store that had served our town for nearly 50 years, long before I was born and long before my hands were strong enough to lift a heavy toolbox. And people respected my dad not because he had the lowest prices or the biggest inventory, but because he treated every person who walked through that door like a neighbor, like someone worth listening to, and not just a sale to push and shove along. And that store had a smell that lived inside my memory, Even today, the smell of wood dust and warm metal and chipped paint mixed with the soft hum of the old ceiling fan and the groan of the wooden floorboards that knew more secrets than any human alive. And when I finished school, I stepped right into that world without hesitation. And I learned everything from repairing stubborn tools to stacking shelves to taking inventory to talking customers out of buying things they did not need because Dad always believed honesty sold more than pressure ever would, and I carried that lesson into every corner of my life. My younger sister Lana, however, was a different kind of soul, a bright, restless spirit who never cared for the dirt under her nails or the long hours the store demanded. She liked city lights, shiny dresses, music, and late nights. And she chased the sparkle that our small town could never truly give her. So she moved away as soon as she finished school, and only came back when she felt like showing a new outfit or spending a holiday reminding us how she was meant for something bigger than a dusty old store. And even though she barely lifted a hammer or learned how to read the inventory sheets, Dad still looked at her with soft eyes like she was his little star, the bright one. The one he believed might someday surprise us all by returning home and carrying the family torch. And I never argued with him because that is what families do. We hold on to hope even when it shakes and sways. And we pretend not to notice when someone has drifted far from the shore because love sometimes makes us blind and patient in all the wrong ways. While I stayed loyal to the shop day and night, Lana floated in and out of our lives wearing fancy clothes, speaking with a tone touched by city airs, and acting like the store was too small, too old, too quiet for her dreams. And still Dad smiled at her the way fathers do, when their hearts refused to let go of the image of their little girl, even though she had grown into someone he barely understood. And sometimes I wondered if he ever noticed just how far she had drifted from our roots and from him and from the values he held so close. Yet he believed she might come back one day and help me carry the legacy he built with his own aging hands. So I kept working and kept the place running and tried to hold everything steady, even when life around me began shifting in ways I did not yet understand. Years went by, and slowly, without any dramatic moment or loud announcement, I became the one running most operations, and Dad began stepping back, not because he wanted to, but because age had begun tugging on him softly at first, then a bit harder with each passing year. And even though he got tired more easily, he still loved coming in every morning, leaning on the counter and talking to customers he had known for decades, sharing stories that stretched across generations and telling jokes that never got old. Even if everybody already knew the punch line, and I watched him shrink a little each year, not in spirit, but in strength, while the store remained the heartbeat of his day, and he refused to give it up because that place was a part of him as much as his own shadow. Life felt steady, peaceful, reliable, like the quiet rhythm of a rocking chair, until one winter morning, when everything changed far quicker than any of us were ready for, and Dad's health suddenly dipped in a way that none of us saw coming, and the strong man who lifted crates and hammered boards for half a century grew pale and weak almost overnight. And the doctors spoke in soft tones that made my stomach twist, because when doctors speak quietly, you know something heavy is waiting behind their silence. And after that winter hit our family like a cold, sharp wind, nothing stayed the same, and the store that once felt like a safe, warm home began to carry a new weight, one that I could not explain at the time, but would soon come to understand as the first shadow of something darker, something growing in the corners of our lives, waiting for the right moment to strike as the heart of our family faltered, and the balance we once trusted began to shift into a storm that none of us were ready to face. Write in details and very, very prolonged max about do not write in point, write in one option. When Dad passed away, it felt like someone switched off every bit of light inside me and left the room cold and hollow and silent in a way that echoed through my bones, because losing him was not just losing a parent. It was losing the man who shaped my hands, my habits, my values, and the way I walked through the world. And when I stood by his grave, I felt like the earth under me was softer and weaker, like even the ground knew something strong had fallen and could not rise again. And I kept replaying his voice. My head steady, patient, full of quiet wisdom, and even the simplest things he used to say now felt like precious stones that I would never hear again. And after the funeral, when the family gathered for the reading of his, well, I walked into that room expecting nothing shocking, because in my heart, I believed Dad trusted me with the store since I had spent most of my life keeping it alive, while he leaned on my shoulder through his last years. And even though grief sat heavy on my chest, I felt sure that everything would be simple, clean, respectful, and maybe even healing. The lawyer sat across from us in that stiff, bright office, and I remember how the air felt still and dry, as if the room itself was waiting for something I could not see coming. And I sat there steady, trying to keep my mind clear, telling myself this meeting would be routine, because Dad always believed in fairness and honesty, and he had said more than once that the store would remain in hands that understood its heart. But the moment the lawyer began reading the will, my breath caught in my throat, because nothing he said matched what I believed would happen, and as each word rolled out of his mouth, it struck me harder and harder, and I felt something heavy slide into the center of my chest. Dad had left the entire business to Lana, and hearing that felt like the world tilted a little under my feet. Because the store, the building, the equipment, the accounts, the paperwork, the rights to the name, all of it was written under her name in that document. And the lawyer kept reading in that flat voice, while I sat there frozen, trying not to let the shock show on my face. And I could not understand why Dad made that choice, because she was never part of the grind. She never fixed a tool, or restocked a shelf, or spent a tired evening closing the shop with sore feet and a full heart. And yet Dad had trusted her with everything, believing she could take the business to a bigger level. And while that dream might have made sense to him, it felt like a sharp sting in my chest, because he did not see how far she drifted away, or how little she understood the world he built. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let anger push through me, because even though my heart was hurting, I wanted to respect the old man's wishes. And I wanted to believe that maybe he saw a future I could not imagine, and that maybe he believed giving her the store would bring her back home and reconnect us as a family instead of tear us apart. And I kept my face calm and my hands still. But something inside me began to twist, because Lana did not look surprised at all. In fact, she looked too confident, too comfortable, almost like she already knew every detail before the lawyer even opened the envelope. And the way she sat with her back straight, and her smile barely tucked away, made my stomach tighten, because her reaction felt rehearsed, like she had already played this moment in her head long before I walked into the room. Still, I forced myself to stay composed, telling myself that grief could easily make me see shadows where there were none, and that maybe I was just overwhelmed and reading too much into her posture and her expression. But my instincts kept tapping on the back of my mind, saying something is wrong, something is off, something is not matching the man you knew and raised you, because Dad was careful, Dad was thorough, and Dad never left anything incomplete, not in business, not in life. And that is when the lawyer mentioned a detail that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. There was a transfer document that needed one final sign-off from Dad before full ownership could legally shift to Lana, and that document had one blank line waiting for his signature. And without that signature, nothing could be finalized. No ownership could be transferred, no legal control could move from the estate to Lana. And the lawyer explained this in a steady voice. But the moment he said it, I felt a strange mix of relief, confusion, and unease wash through me, because it did not make sense that Dad would do everything else so carefully, and yet forget the most important step at the finish line. That one missing signature felt like a crack in a wall that had looked solid until that moment, and suddenly, the entire story took on a different shape, and Lana shifted in her seat in a way that told me she did not like hearing that detail, because her smile faded and her confident posture wavered for a split second. And in that tiny moment, I saw something under the surface, something restless, something irritated, something she did not want anyone to notice, and that reaction told me more than anything else in that room. That missing signature became the center of everything that followed, and it became the spark that turned quiet suspicion into a storm, because it meant something had been planned, and something had gone wrong, and whatever Lana expected to happen had not played out the way she hoped. And that single blank line on that document became the thread that once pulled would unravel months of secrets, lies, and intentions I never imagined would exist inside my own family. And from that moment on, my life was no longer guided by simple grief or quiet respect, but by a growing feeling that something dark was waiting to be uncovered, and the truth would not stay hidden forever. At first, Lana acted like the perfect grieving daughter, the kind who clutched framed photos to her chest and wiped her eyes every few minutes as if the memory of Dad was too heavy for her to carry. She spoke softly, almost angelically, convincing everyone around her that she only wanted to honor his legacy, keep the business safe, and respect every brick he ever laid. She even hugged me the day after the will reading, whispering that she admired my loyalty and she would never forget how much I had done to keep the place running. For a moment, I actually believed her. I thought maybe the shock of the will had just shaken me too hard, and maybe she really did care. But grief can act like a fog, and while it blurs some things, it also makes the smallest details unexpectedly sharp. Because just 3 days later, that fog started clearing, and what I saw behind Lana's sweet voice and rehearsed emotions, it didn't feel innocent anymore. She showed up at the store in a brand new outfit, heels clicking like she wanted the whole building to announce her presence. And she didn't come alone. Beside her walked a woman with a polished black suit and a stare so cold it felt like she was judging every inch of the shop before she even crossed the threshold. She introduced herself with a quick handshake and a name that sounded too smooth, too corporate, too out of place for a family business built on Dad's sweat and community trust. She called herself a business consultant, but the way she carried herself, she looked more like someone who dismantles things for a living. I watched the consultant glide around the shop, scanning shelves, analyzing inventory, peeking into back rooms as if she had every right to be there. She murmured things to Lana, quick, strategic whispers, like they had already talked about all this long before they arrived. And every time she turned back to look at the store, she wore an expression that said she didn't see a beloved family business. She saw a project she planned to strip down and rebuild into something unrecognizable. I pulled Lana aside and asked what she was doing, why she brought someone into the store without even talking to me first. She didn't even flinch. She just shrugged, almost casually, and said, "It's for the transition." That one word, transition, hit me in the gut harder than anything the lawyer had said during the will reading. It wasn't just the word itself, it was the way she said it, like it was already happening, like everything was already hers. Like my years of sacrifice and Dad's lifetime of dedication were nothing more than outdated chapters she planned to erase. But the truth is, I didn't fully grasp what she meant until later that afternoon, when one of the staff members quietly told me that Lana had already started sharing ideas about rebranding the entire shop. Not small tweaks, not respectful upgrades. She wanted to gut the entire identity of the place, change the name, scrap the history, replace loyal employees with cheaper new hires, and turn the shop into some modern flashy chain like she was dreaming of becoming the next big retail sensation. And the thing that made my stomach twist, she had these plans prepared in printed documents, professionally made, perfectly formatted. It was too polished, too thorough, too ready. No grieving daughter drafts a business overhaul 3 days after her father's funeral, unless she had it planned long before the coffin was lowered. And suddenly the whole picture shifted. Her confidence during the will reading, the way she didn't blink, the way she didn't even look surprised, it wasn't grief. It wasn't faith in Dad's dream. It was certainty, preparedness, like she had already memorized every word of that will before the lawyer ever opened his mouth. Things got worse when the consultant started asking for financial records, vendor lists, account access, things no future owner is entitled to until the legal process ends. She asked like she expected me to obey instantly, but when I hesitated, her tone turned sharper, like I was the one being unreasonable. She kept insisting everything was already settled, already decided, already clear in the will. But there was one thing they kept conveniently ignoring. One thing I refused to let them sweep under the rug. Dad's final signature. The missing signature on the transfer document wasn't just a detail, it was the law. Without it, ownership couldn't shift. Without it, everything stayed exactly where it was. And every time I brought it up, Lana avoided eye contact like the topic physically burned her. She changed the subject, whispered to the consultant, or pretended she was suddenly too busy to talk. That silence told me more than any argument could have. She knew that missing signature wasn't a mistake. It was a barrier. A barrier she desperately wanted to break through before someone noticed, and someone stopped her. That missing mark of ink, that single unfinished line on a page, became the last shield protecting the business, protecting Dad's real intentions, and protecting me from the takeover that was beginning to feel less like inheritance and more like a setup waiting to explode. A week after the chaos began, when the air in the house still smelled faintly of incense from the funeral, and the curtains remained half-drawn like the rooms had not yet decided whether they were ready to let light back in, I found myself standing outside Dad's old study. I don't know what pulled me there. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was grief, maybe it was the need to feel close to him again. Or maybe some part of me sensed that answers, real answers, were hiding in the silence he left behind. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the same familiar sound from childhood, when I used to sneak in looking for him after school. The air inside felt untouched, as if Dad had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second to catch me going through his drawers like a curious kid again. I walked slowly, my fingers brushing over the shelves lined with dusty books, old ledgers, framed memories, and little souvenirs he had collected from places I didn't even know he had visited. His study was a museum of his life, organized chaos, thoughtful piles, handwritten notes tucked between pages. The weight of the room made my throat tighten. I wasn't just sorting through belongings. I was walking through the last pieces of him. I opened his desk drawers one by one, carefully, respectfully. Old keys, receipts, a watch that no longer ticked, pens with fading ink, letters from customers thanking him for his kindness. Every little thing felt like a message, a reminder of the man who built everything I knew. But as I kept searching, I noticed something unusual. One corner of the bookshelf had a tiny gap, just wide enough to suggest something had been pushed behind the books. It didn't look like an accident. Dad was meticulous. Nothing in that room was ever misplaced. I pulled the books forward, creating a small cascade of dust, and behind them I found a worn brown folder. Its edges were creased, its surface slightly faded, as if it had been there hidden for quite some time. My heartbeat quickened. A folder hidden behind books in a room Dad always kept tidy, that meant something. That meant it was placed there deliberately. I opened it slowly, almost afraid of what I might find. Inside, the first few pages were simple printed documents, dated emails, handwritten notes, legal drafts. But when I kept reading, a sharp chill ran through me. These weren't ordinary papers. They were communication records between Dad and a legal advisor, letters, meeting summaries, handwritten reminders scribbled in his own familiar handwriting. And the tone of those documents, it wasn't confident. It wasn't satisfied. It was troubled. It was hesitant. I read one line, then another, and each one felt like a punch. Dad had doubts. Real doubts. He had been reconsidering his decision to leave the entire business to Lana. My hands trembled slightly as I turned another page. One note from Dad said he worried she lacked discipline with money, that her spending habits were unpredictable. He was afraid she would drain resources too quickly, make impulsive choices, or worse, sell the business altogether without understanding its true value. In another document, he admitted he wasn't sure she could handle the pressure, the responsibility, or the staff who depended on the business for their livelihoods. He even questioned whether her recent behavior was influenced by people around her, who didn't have the family's best interests at heart. And then, buried near the bottom of the folder, was the most important document of all. A formal letter signed by Dad and addressed to his lawyer, instructing them to hold off on completing the transfer of ownership. It was dated only weeks before he passed away, He clearly wrote that he wanted to revise the will, rethink the distribution, and make changes that better protected the business and the family. He wasn't ready to finalize anything. He wanted more time. He needed more clarity. And that missing signature, the one Lana avoided talking about, suddenly made perfect, painful sense. Dad intentionally withheld his approval. He wasn't confused, he wasn't careless, he wasn't forgetful. He changed his mind. He didn't want everything to go to Lana the way it was laid out in the earlier drafts. He wanted to adjust things, balance things, maybe even shift the ownership entirely. And because he didn't get the chance to finalize those changes, the only thing preventing a complete takeover was the one signature he never gave. I sat back in his old leather chair, gripping that letter as if it were a lifeline. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs with a mix of shock and sorrow. The truth was right there in my hands, not vague, not gray, not hidden between lines. It was clear, direct, undeniable. Dad had doubts about Lana. Dad had concerns. Dad wanted to hold back. Dad intended to revise everything. And if I could see this, then maybe Lana could too. Maybe she had found something similar. Maybe she had overheard something. Or maybe Dad had confronted her about his worries, and that was why she was now rushing, pushing, and dragging that consultant around like they were racing against time. It suddenly explained everything. Her confidence at the will reading, her urgency to rebrand the store, her hostility when I mentioned the missing signature, her attempts to dig into the files before anything was officially hers. She wasn't acting out of grief. She was acting out of fear. Fear that if the truth surfaced, this truth, everything she felt entitled to would crumble. She needed control before anyone discovered what Dad had planned. She needed ownership before questions were asked. She needed the power before reality caught up with her. I felt anger rise inside me, not the explosive kind, but a deep, painful burn that comes from betrayal. A betrayal that cuts not just through business or documents, but through blood, trust, and the last wishes of a dying father. This wasn't just about a shop. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about legacy. This was about truth. This was about the difference between what Dad trusted us to protect and what one of us was trying to twist for personal gain. I closed the folder slowly, holding it against my chest like it was a fragile piece of him, because in many ways it was. His fears, his hopes, his unfinished plans, his final attempt to protect what he built. And my own sister, my own blood, was ready to bury it all just to claim something that wasn't even fully meant for her. If you want the next section, Section 6, the confrontation begins. I can write it with the same depth, intensity, and emotional weight. The next morning I woke up before dawn, long before the streets outside began to stir, long before the sun even bothered rising over the rooftops of our small town. I barely slept the night before. My mind kept replaying every page from that folder, every note Dad wrote, every doubt he had, every warning he left behind. I felt the weight of all of it sitting on my chest like a stone. I knew what I had to do. I had to face Lana. No more pretending. No more being polite for the sake of keeping peace. This was bigger than a family disagreement. This was about truth, legacy, and protecting the one thing Dad poured his entire life into. When I reached the store that morning, the air felt cold and sharp in a way that almost told me something tense was waiting behind the door. As I inserted my key into the lock, I heard noise inside, papers rustling, drawers opening and closing, footsteps moving back and forth. I pushed the door open and stepped inside quietly. And there she was, Lana, standing behind the counter with her hair tied up in a tight, messy bun, looking more like she was preparing for a corporate presentation rather than visiting her childhood home. She had papers scattered all across the counter, files opened, sticky notes everywhere, and her consultant standing beside her flipping through documents as if they had every right to touch any of it. Lana looked up at me like I was an inconvenience she did not ask for, like I was standing in a room that she believed belonged to her. She didn't even greet me. She just sighed and asked what I was doing there so early, as if I had not been the one opening that shop every morning for decades. I walked further inside and leaned against one of the shelves, keeping my voice steady even though I felt my pulse climbing. I told her we needed to talk, not later, not eventually, right now. She rolled her eyes the same way she used to when we were teenagers, and she didn't want to deal with responsibility. The consultant shifted her weight, clearly irritated, clearly wishing I would disappear. I ignored both of them because what I had to say was too important to worry about their attitude. I told Lana about the folder I found in Dad's study. I told her about the notes, the doubts, the concerns, the conversations he had with the legal advisor. I told her Dad wanted to revise the will and that he intentionally held back the final signature that would have handed her the business. I watched her face carefully as I spoke. At first she went still, almost frozen. Her eyes widened slightly and her fingers stopped moving through the papers. For a moment she looked like the truth had punched the air right out of her chest. For a moment she looked scared, vulnerable, almost caught. Then, as quickly as that flicker appeared, it disappeared. She straightened her posture, crossed her arms, and her expression hardened into that familiar mask she wore when she felt cornered. She looked at me and told me I was making things up. She said I must have misunderstood Dad's intentions. She claimed I was twisting things out of grief and jealousy. She tried to make me seem unreasonable in front of her consultant, but her voice did not ring steady. Her eyes kept shifting away from mine. Something in her tone betrayed her. She knew exactly what I found, and she knew it was real. I stepped closer to the counter with the same calm I used when dealing with difficult customers over the years. I told her Dad's handwriting was very clear, his instructions were clear, his doubts were clear, and that missing signature was not an accident, it was deliberate. And without that signature, she had no authority to touch anything in that store, not the staff, not the inventory, not the accounts, not even the future plans. That was when the consultant stepped in like she was some sort of guard dog protecting her client. She stood between us and warned me that delaying the transition would cost the business time and money. She tried using big corporate phrases to pressure me, but none of it held any weight because none of it changed the truth. I told her politely but firmly that she did not work here and she had no say in anything. I also told her I had already spoken to the estate lawyer that morning before coming to the store, and according to legal guidelines, absolutely nothing could move forward without that missing signature. No changes, no rebranding, no decision-making, no transition of authority. The lawyer was already reviewing the documents I found. That meant every little thing they were trying to do was now frozen. Lana's face flushed red. She snapped at me. She said I was trying to grab her inheritance. She said I was jealous because Dad trusted her future more than mine. Hearing her talk like that felt like someone was dragging a blade across old scars. I stayed silent for a long moment because I needed to choose my words carefully. Then I told her the truth, that I had spent 30 years in that store. 30 years of showing up early, closing late, fixing shelves, repairing tools, helping customers in storms, handling finances when Dad was too tired. I wasn't stealing anything. I wasn't fighting for greed. I was fighting for Dad's real wishes. The ones he left behind in that hidden folder. The ones he never got the chance to finalize. Things went quiet for a moment. The consultant looked uncomfortable. Lana looked furious. Her jaw clenched so hard I could almost hear the tension in the room. She grabbed her bag, swept the papers angrily into a stack, and stormed out of the store like she couldn't stand the air around me. I watched her leave knowing this wasn't over. People fueled by greed don't walk away when things get tough. They push harder. They climb darker paths. They twist truth to fit their desires. The storm had only started. And deep down, I knew Lana was about to do everything in her power to get what she believed was hers, even if it meant burning every bridge left in our family. I did not wake up one morning craving revenge. That is not who I am, and that is not how my father raised me. I wanted fairness. I wanted peace. I wanted the truth to stand on its own without needing a fight. But wanting peace does not mean you get it, especially when someone you love decides to twist everything that was meant to hold your family together. The moment I realized Lana was not just being impulsive or emotional, but was fully committed to taking over the business behind my back, something hardened inside me. She crossed a line the night she tried sneaking into the store with her consultant, thinking I would not notice the lights flickering or the door opening after closing hours. They were going through drawers, trying to access the financial records, opening files that were locked for a reason. That was the moment I realized this was no longer sibling tension. This was a full-blown takeover attempt. And if I didn't step in, Dad's legacy would be lost in the hands of someone who saw it as a stepping stone rather than a responsibility. So I began planning, not out of spite but out of duty, out of loyalty to the man who spent his life building something that meant more than profits or expansion. I started by documenting every suspicious thing Lana had done from the moment Dad passed. Every unapproved meeting she held with her consultant, every time she tried to access restricted documents, every sudden visit where she acted like she owned the place already. I wrote down dates, times, descriptions. I took pictures when needed. I saved copies of email exchanges she pressured employees into signing. I built a trail because I knew sooner or later she would try to twist the story and claim innocence. People driven by greed never admit fault. They only rewrite the script. The second thing I did was gather all the notes and documents I found in Dad's study. I placed them in a secure folder and took both digital and physical copies. Those notes were not just evidence. They were Dad's voice, his fears, his careful thoughts written in ink. I knew those papers carried more weight than anything I could say out loud. They were the key to proving what he truly wanted. The third step was something that came from years of relationships. I visited our longtime employees one by one, the folks who were with us through storms, downturns, holidays, and quiet weekday afternoons. Men and women who knew Dad as more than a boss. They knew his values and his intentions. When I told them what Lana was trying to do, they were shocked but not entirely surprised. Everyone knew she had always been distant from the business. Everyone knew I was the one who carried the weight when things got tough. Many of them offered to give statements about conversations they had with Dad where he made it clear I would be the one continuing the legacy. They wrote letters. They spoke to the lawyer. They stood behind me the way they always stood behind him. There was something comforting in that support, something that reminded me that loyalty still existed even when family failed to show it. And it wasn't just employees. Customers stepped forward too. Folks who had been coming to the store for years. People Dad helped without expecting anything in return. Neighbors who respected the shop as a cornerstone of the town. They told me stories about how Dad always praised my dedication. How he always said the store would stay in the hands of someone who understood its soul. Those words meant everything. They were living proof that Dad's intentions were never a mystery to the people around him. Only Lana seemed blind to them, or maybe she chose to be. After gathering all of that, I scheduled a detailed meeting with the estate lawyer. I requested a full legal review of the transfer documents, the missing signature, the notes and letters Dad left, and the timeline of his communication with the legal advisor. The lawyer's expression shifted slowly the more he read. He took off his glasses. He leaned back. He asked me to walk him through each event exactly as it happened. For the first time since Dad passed, I felt like I was not shouting into a void. Someone finally saw the full picture. Someone finally understood that the missing signature was not a technical hiccup, but a deliberate choice. A decision Dad made because he wasn't ready to trust everything to Lana. But I didn't stop there. I quietly began a community petition. I did not want it to be aggressive or dramatic. I simply explained the town's fear of losing the local store to a flashy rebrand or some big chain concept that Lana was pushing. People signed without hesitation. They spoke about what the store meant to them, how it carried memories, how it represented the spirit of the town, how they didn't want to lose it to someone who barely showed up or understood its history. Within days, the petition grew so fast it surprised even me. This wasn't just my battle now. It was the town. It was a collective voice rising to protect something that belonged to all of us in one way or another. By the time I finished assembling everything, my case was solid. Not because I wanted to win a fight, but because the truth was too strong to ignore. And through that entire process, something inside me shifted. I realized this wasn't just about stopping Lana. It was about protecting Dad's final wishes. It was about making sure the legacy he poured his life into did not fall into careless hands. When I finally looked at the pile of evidence, the statements, the documents, the petition, the timeline, the legal notes, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I wasn't trying to embarrass her. I wanted her to see what legacy really meant. That it isn't something you grab like a prize. It is something you honor with your actions. Something you preserve with sincerity. Something you earn through loyalty, sacrifice, discipline, and heart. And if she refused to understand that, then I would show her in the only way she would understand. Not through anger, through truth. The day of the final meeting arrived with a strange quiet in the air, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come out of this long storm that had pulled our family apart. I drove to the lawyer's office early because I needed a moment to gather myself before things unfolded. My mind replayed every long night I spent preparing the evidence, every memory of my father telling me to stand tall, every promise I made to myself that I would protect the store no matter what. When I walked into the meeting room, the air felt thick and heavy, like the truth was already waiting in the center of the table. Lana walked in a few minutes later wearing a calm expression, but I could see the tension hiding behind it. Her shoulders looked stiff, her steps were quick and sharp, like she was trying hard to convince herself that she still had the upper hand. The consultant followed behind her, but she stayed quiet this time, not nearly as bold as she had been in the store. Maybe she finally understood this was no simple business deal. This was about a legacy far older and deeper than any corporate plan. The estate lawyer entered last, and he carried a large folder filled with every document we had submitted, every note I found in Dad's study, every statement from employees, every signature from the community petition. He sat down, slowly placed the folder in front of him, and opened it without saying a word at first. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Finally, the lawyer began reading through the documents carefully, one by one. He moved with patience, like he wanted to make sure we understood every detail, every line, every truth written on those pages. Lana sat across from him with her chin lifted, but her eyes darting over the table in small nervous shifts. I stayed quiet with my hands resting on my knees, because I knew the truth did not need me to shout for it. It only needed space to breathe. When the lawyer reached the transfer document, the room shifted. He paused in the middle of the page, looked up, and said in a steady, clear voice that, without the missing signature, nothing legally transfers. He did not soften his tone for her, and he did not try to cushion the truth. He simply stated it as it was, and the impact hit the room like a weight dropping onto the table. Lana blinked rapidly, and her breath caught for a moment, but before she could speak, the lawyer continued. He slid Dad's handwritten notes across the table and explained that the dates, the wording, and the instructions showed that Dad had asked for time to revise the will. Then I placed everything I had gathered on the table. The letters from employees, the written statements from customers, the petition signed by half the town, the printed emails, the timeline of her attempts to move into the store before anything was legally processed. I did not raise my voice. I did not use harsh words. I simply presented the truth just the way it stood. At first, Lana tried to speak, but her voice cracked and nothing clear came out. She reached for her consultant, but the consultant stepped back with a quiet, uneasy expression, like she suddenly realized she had walked into something far more personal and far more serious than she expected. Lana looked down at the table and then back up at the lawyer with wide eyes filled not with sadness but with pure frustration. She was not crying because she felt guilty. She was crying because her plan was falling apart in front of her. The lawyer leaned back in his chair and explained the situation in full. Based on the collected evidence, the will could not be acted on as written. The transfer was incomplete. The intentions were uncertain. The business would remain legally frozen until a court reviewed the matter fully. He said it was highly likely that the court would consider Dad's final notes as valid proof of his intentions, and that the original transfer to Lana had never been meant to proceed. I sat still, letting his words sink into the room. I did not feel victory. I felt relief and sadness mixed together like two old friends who knew they would never separate completely. I did not want to hurt my sister. I wanted fairness. But sometimes fairness arrives wearing the face of justice, and justice arrives wearing the weight of truth. And truth does not walk gently when it has been ignored. Later, after weeks of hearings and reviews, the court announced its decision. The store would remain under my management as acting leader until the revision of the will was completed. Lana was not granted authority to change anything in the meantime. She had no control over staff, no permission to rebrand, and no permission to make any structural decisions. The store would continue exactly the way it had for decades until the legal process finished. Months passed and the revised will was finally approved. The court honored Dad's updated intentions. Joint ownership between me and Lana, but full management authority granted to me alone. That meant every major decision rested in my hands. Lana could participate in discussions, but she could not override anything or push her own agenda without my agreement. It was a balance, but a balanced one. The store was safe. The legacy was protected. The truth had been heard. In the weeks after the verdict, the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But in my life, everything felt strangely quiet. Almost like the silence that follows a storm that destroyed more than you expected, yet somehow spared just enough for you to rebuild. Lana packed her things and left town without saying a word. No dramatic exit, no final insult, no forced goodbye. Just silence. The kind that makes you wonder if blood really is thicker than ambition. For months we lived in separate worlds, drifting like strangers who once shared the same childhood, the same roof, the same memories of running through the aisles of Dad's hardware store, pretending the shelves were mountains and the tools were hidden treasures. I told myself I didn't miss her, but some nights that lie felt thin. And then one evening, just when the weight of everything had settled into a routine, my phone rang. The moment I saw her name, my heart tightened. Not in fear, not in anger, but in a complicated mixture of old affection and freshly mended wounds. Her voice on the other end was small, fragile, nothing like the sharp, defensive tone she had used in every confrontation leading up to the legal battle. She took a shaky breath and said she had spent a lot of time thinking about everything that happened. She admitted she let greed take over her better judgment, admitted that when she first learned about Dad's estate, she saw the store as a way out of her financial troubles rather than what it truly was, a piece of our family, a symbol of his life, his values, his pride. She apologized for every lie, every accusation, every moment she tried to twist Dad's intentions to serve her own desperation. That apology, simple, honest, and unpolished, cut deeper than any insult she had thrown at me. I could hear the regret in her voice, the kind that does not come from losing a legal battle but from realizing you lost something far more personal, trust. And in that moment I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge isn't the end of the story, closure is. And closure sometimes comes wrapped in forgiveness. So I forgave her. Not because she suddenly deserved it, but because holding on to resentment is like trying to keep a burning coal in your hand, hoping the other person gets burned first. Letting go was freeing. After that call, life slowly stitched itself back into something whole. The store, once threatened, now stood stronger than ever. I poured myself into the work not out of fear of losing it again, but out of love for what it represented. I modernized the space, new lighting, updated shelves, a small digital inventory system. But I left the wooden counter exactly the way Dad kept it, with its worn edges and the tiny scratch that he never bothered to fix because a little imperfection builds character. Customers continued to visit, many of them old regulars who had known Dad for decades. They would lean on the counter, look around the store, and tell me it still felt like him, like his presence lingered in the smell of sawdust, the neatly labeled tool drawers, the warmth in the air that made you feel welcomed rather than sold to. And sometimes, after closing time, when the street outside was quiet and the lights hummed softly above my head, I would stand behind that counter and feel a deep, grounding peace settle over me. A sense of accomplishment, not loud or dramatic, but gentle and steady, like the quiet assurance that I had protected more than a business. I had protected a story, a history, a promise. In those moments I realized I had done exactly what Dad trusted me to do. I upheld the legacy he built with his own hands, sweat and heart. I kept the business honest, steady and true to its roots. And though my relationship with Lana still had places that needed healing, that one phone call reminded me that family ties bend far more than they break. It reminded me that even though people lose themselves sometimes, they can find their way back when someone holds the truth steady enough for them to return to. And as I locked up the store one evening, feeling the night breeze brush against my face, I whispered a quiet message to Dad. Not a prayer, not a plea, but a simple thank you. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for teaching me what loyalty really means. Thank you for leaving behind something worth fighting for. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about winning. It was a story about safeguarding what matters. It was about love disguised as responsibility, and responsibility disguised as legacy. And as long as I stand in the store, as long as its doors stay open to the community, as long as every shelf carries the warmth Dad built into it, his legacy will never fade. It will live on through me, through the people he helped, through the place he left behind. And that is the truest, quietest victory of all. If there is one thing I hope anyone taking the time to listen to my story remembers, it is that greed is a quiet thief, sneaky and persistent, capable of blinding even the people you hold closest to your heart. Greed can make your own blood, someone you grew up with, someone you shared birthdays and holidays with, forget the meaning of loyalty, respect, and love. Lana's choices reminded me that even the people we trust the most can stumble into darkness when desire overshadows judgment. And yet, in the same breath, I also learned that truth has a stubborn persistence, a strength that doesn't announce itself with violence or drama, but instead endures quietly until it can no longer be ignored. Patience is the companion of truth. Waiting, observing, gathering facts, listening to voices of reason, and respecting the timing of things, all of it matters more than the impulse to fight or react in the heat of anger. Never underestimate the small signs. The subtle hints, the hesitation in a glance, the skip steps, or the one missing signature on a piece of paper can be the difference between disaster and salvation. That tiny line Dad never signed became the fulcrum of everything I fought to protect. It was not an oversight. It was a quiet act of foresight, a safeguard placed with love and caution. The simplest things can carry the heaviest weight, and the smallest actions can change the trajectory of lives and legacies. Protecting a legacy is not about asserting control or winning power over someone else. It is about honoring what was entrusted to you, nurturing it, and ensuring it survives for future generations. It is about understanding that a legacy carries the memory, the values, the sweat, and the spirit of someone who built it with their own hands. It is not a trophy. It is a responsibility. Trust, as I learned, can break in an instant, but it can also be rebuilt when honesty meets humility, and both sides are willing to reflect and grow. I have seen it happen with Lana. The walls between us were thick and tense, but one moment of vulnerability, one apology born of understanding, began to mend what greed had threatened to destroy. Family, I discovered, has the power to wound more deeply than any outsider ever could, because they know our weaknesses, our routines, our hearts. And yet, family also has the power to heal in ways no one else can, to restore faith in connections, to teach patience, forgiveness, and the meaning of shared history. The last signature, that simple line of ink that Dad never applied, was more than a legal requirement. It was a lesson, a test, and ultimately a chance. A chance to protect not just the business, but the ideals Dad lived by, the values he held sacred, and the trust he had in me to carry everything forward with care and respect. And in the end, when the dust settled and the store stood secure, filled with familiar faces, the smell of polished wood and metal, and the warmth of customers who had been part of our story for decades, I understood clearly what mattered most. It was never about wealth, power, or victory over someone else. It was about safeguarding a life's work, honoring the lessons passed down, and keeping a promise silently made to a father whose wisdom guided me even after he was gone. That is the real legacy, the true reward, and the most profound truth I could carry forward. The last signature was missing for a reason, and because of it, I did not just save a business. I preserved trust, love, and history, the things that truly define what we leave behind. And in the quiet moments standing behind that counter, I can feel that legacy living on, breathing in the walls and corners, reminding me that integrity, patience, and honor always shine brighter than greed ever could.